Gina, cap back there, Jana.
Wait till I start taking a chair. Yeah.
5, 4, 3, 2. The Wednesday meeting of the State Board of Education is called to order. All members, Mr. McNeese is not present in the room, but he's here somewhere. I know that because I brought him over at 8 o'clock this morning. All members are now present. At this time, a motion would be in order to approve today's agenda. Ben makes that motion. Is there a second to that motion? Betty seconds that motion. All in favor, please raise your hand. All opposed, the motion carries. And now we are excited about the opportunity to act on public school expenditures for ESSER II and federal COVID relief funds. And is that you, Doug?
That is me.
Welcome to the State Board of Education again.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the board. I think we're going to start with slide 19 this morning. Am I going to advance that, or is Eric going to pull it up for me?
Just go on.
So we stand for questions this morning, I guess.
In my view, of course, I'd seen it before, but Dina, go ahead.
I received a email from one of my superintendents, Jason Klein, who is the superintendent at South Brown County. And what he sent to me, I thought maybe everyone should hear, and then if the chair will allow, I will also make a comment. He says, I was watching the State Board of Education meeting this afternoon and heard the request of USD 430 had on ESSER funds to help pay for a teacher who did an outstanding job streaming events throughout the year. I wanted to explain my decision moving forward and requesting that the item be left on the application. I was informed that the reason why it would not be approved is that it is non-academic. However, we streamed everything this year from music concerts, plays, programs, and athletic events. Although the football game on Friday night might not be academics based, the music or band concerts that were streamed covered several standards throughout the curriculum. When we look at reaching the whole child, extracurricular becomes a major part of making sure all students are successful. Also, the social, emotional of students, parents, and community comes into play when we streamed events this year. At the end of the day, the amount is very little and will not have a negative influence on our school budget. However, the reason behind why we streamed events this year is 100% related to COVID and the restrictions we had to follow. Jason Klein, Superintendent, USD 430, South Brown County. And as I've been involved in reading at least the items both from Eanes and Esser, I know we've been consistent in saying that events that were streamed that were not part of the curriculum or the academics, considered academics in total, are things that the federal government had made pretty clear that academics needed to be the one that, and the safety precautions for COVID. So I understand why, and I think we need to be consistent. I'm sure everyone would say somewhat the same thing, that, and I think they're right, that it was a social, emotional experience that was positive for everyone. So with that, I do support the decision, because I think we have to be consistent in our application, because if we're not, we will have a lot of schools that may be in jeopardy of having to repay down the road that amount. So I just wanted to share what with all my colleagues what Jason was saying, and because I think that's valuable too, and I would hope that we never have another pandemic that we have to deal with, but perhaps those kinds of things that have value to students could be considered also. Thank you.
And Dina, we had this discussion we've had this discussion more than once at the table, and we have sometimes reasonable, vigorous discussions. The team that presents to us, and I have absolute confidence in them. They've been extremely impressive. Believe that is not approvable based on the federal regulations, and I for one am going to have to support that. If at some point in the future the task force, if something changes and the task force wants to discuss that again, we may come back with different recommendations. But absent that, I believe that we need to proceed with the recommendations as they are. I don't see any other questions, so at this point, a motion would be in order. Janet.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move that the Kansas State Board of Education accept the recommendations of the Commissioners' Task Force on ESSER and Eanes distribution of money, and approve the submission of school district expenditure plans for ESSER 2 federal COVID-19 relief funds as presented.
Is there a second to that motion? Jim McNeese seconds that motion. And by the way, Dina, if I were in the superintendent's seat right now, I would be making the exact same argument. So, okay, is there any further discussion? Did you? Okay, go ahead, Ms. Yes.
Thank you, Chairman Porter. I just wanted to make a comment. As I will be voting no on this. I can understand the ESSER 1 funding, but as far as the states, if you look across the United States and the ones that were more restrictive and the ones that were more freely and open and as far as had more local and state control on that, they opened up their states. We had a lot of money that we sent back because it had to be used by December of last year and didn't use all that money up. I think the ESSER 2, I just can't support that. I feel like the ESSER one was for the immediate pandemic, and the rest of this, I just feel it's not, it's federal money coming in, and there's always strings attached to that, and I just feel I can't support this at this time. I just want to make that comment. ESSER one maybe, but ESSER two I cannot support. Thank you.
So it's the concept of federal funding in this case that okay, I just wanted to make sure we all understood that. Thank you. Okay, it's time to vote. All in favor of the motion, please raise your hand. All opposed? Motion 9-1, and it carries. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And before I leave, I just wanted to mention Peggy passed out a handout for you this morning. There'd been a request about some summer programs that you might be interested in. We kind of broke those out by your districts for you to look at. So just for your information, some of the ones that we felt gave us a lot of details that if you wanted to visit somebody, that might be someplace to go. I know in Ms. Arnold's district, she has Wichita, and I know that Wichita is spending a lot of ESSER one funds for their summer program, so that's why they're not on here. So, thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much. And now legislative matters and legislative liaison report. Craig, John, Dina, and Ben. We'll start with you, Craig.
All right, thank you. Legislatively, we just basically have one item to address with you this morning. We went through bills and so forth that had passed at the last meeting and are bringing back to you a portion of House Bill 2134 that funded K-12 education. And as a part of that bill, the legislature provided that funding for 3 different items would be made through ESSER funds by the State Department of Education. $5 million for school safety and security grants, $3.9 million for the health intervention team pilot, which is in addition to the funding that was provided this year. They will fund it again at the same level next year. And then in addition, they wanted to add $3.9 million using ESSER funds and $100,000 for communities and schools. So each of those 3, the legislature recommended that the State Department of Education and you, the State Board, fund using the ESSER money, the administrative ESSER money that came to the state. But all 3 contained a provision that if the above agency, that's you, determines such monies may not be used for such purposes, expenditures shall not be made, and the agencies shall send a copy of such determination to the Director of the Budget and the Director of Legislative Research. So I believe you have a copy of what we proposed as a letter that would go to the Director of the Budget and the Director of Legislative Research. And it is based on the language in the ESSER funds primarily. So school safety and security grants, the way they're spelled out in the legislative action, in our opinion, and we think we're fairly solid on that, do not qualify for ESSER funding related to COVID. The grant asked for, or the legislation asked that the money be spent on security cameras, hardening entrances, those types of things, which aren't really related to COVID. That's a different type of security that they are referring to. Mental health initiative, you can use specifically ESSER funds for mental health. You can use ESSER funds for after-school programs such as communities and schools, as long as you can show that both are related directly to COVID, which you certainly could with mental health, at least portions of it. The issue, however, is that the federal legislation provides that the authority for spending those administrative funds rests with the state educational agency, which in Kansas case is the State Board of Education. And the State Board already took action for allocation of the administrative funds in both ESSER 2 and ESSER 3. 2 different times you are using that money for activities that you've gone over several times now. Several of the contracts were approved yesterday for summer programs, before and after school programs, money for school districts to term we used was true up, provide a minimum amount per student for each district so that they can meet their COVID needs, as well as special education, additional money going there. So you've already taken action to spend that money, which means there is no administrative money left for the purposes that the legislature outlined. And that's the short version, somewhat short, of what's contained in this letter that we would propose sending to the Director of Budget and Director of Legislative Research. And I would ask, John, what did I leave out? You got it. Okay, thank you.
I think it's important. I appreciate that, and I think that we all sort of expected that, at least I did, from the very beginning. I think it's important as we communicate to the legislature or anybody else that we are, and that the State Board of Education really wants partnerships, really wants to work with people. But that's a two-way street. There's a possibility that if we'd been involved in the discussion before we made our decision, that some of these things could be accommodated. But that did not happen. And so I would hope ongoing in the future that instead of just passing laws expecting us to do something, that we need to be at the table, we need to be involved in the discussion so that we can come up with a thing that works for everybody instead of just having something imposed upon us that we do not believe that we can do, part of it legally and part of it because we've already expended that money according to our responsibility as part of the federal grant. So does that make sense?
Yes.
So I would hope that, you know, that as we communicate, that we can always communicate the willingness of the Board of Education to be a partner. But we need to be a partner before the fact instead of after the fact. Is that okay with everybody, that message? Any other questions of Craig on this issue? If not, I guess we'll proceed with one of my least favorite parts of being a member of the State Board of Education, the budget options.
And as the Deputy Commissioner for Fiscal Services, I'll try not to be offended by that. Actually, I always used to tell my board when I was superintendent the same thing. I understand this is not what you want to sit through. Okay. Oh man, how'd I do that? There we go. Fiscal Services, not IT. So we have some information on budget options, and just for a little background why you're doing this, there's a requirement each year for the state board to provide a recommendation on the budget to the governor. And you are recommending budget options for fiscal year 23. So the budget for the upcoming year is set. We're looking at a year down the road. What would you like to see in the budget at that point in time? And so typically we go through where we are at the moment in June and show you possible options based on some actions that the board has taken in the past. We'll come back in July and walk through much of the same information, and at that point, ask for some decisions about what you would like to recommend, if anything, be changed in where the budget stands at the moment. Then as an agency, we put that together and present the budget to the Division of Budget, and they follow on with the recommendation then to the governor, which the governor uses as she sees fit when she proposes to the legislature. So with that in mind, we'll look at a little bit of each of the funds, maybe quite a little bit in some cases, and how we got to the point we're at now, and what you may or may not want to recommend. Again, just for discussion purposes this month, and hopefully some decisions in July. So the general fund for a school district is primarily tied to the base. How much do they receive per student? And there's a lot of weighting factors and everything else, but it all comes back to the base. Dale would tell you the peanut is the base. And you can see there what's happened to the base amount over the years. And of course, it has been affected by court cases. Most recent one being Gannon, that was settled a few years ago. And the Supreme Court and the legislature agreed on a plan to fund it over the course of 5 years, to bring it back up to what the court determined was an appropriate level. So for the current year that we just finished, $4,569 was the base. It's already in statute that it will go to $4,706 and then $4,846. And those are 3% increases each year. So for a school district, if your enrollment stayed flat, your general fund budget's going to grow 3% each of the next 2 years.
Thank you. Craig, did they write into the law that after the 5 years it grows by inflation?
That's exactly right. So if
Okay.
we had 2024 on here, you would see CPI. The base is intended to increase by the Consumer Price Index. And that's never been written into statute before. Yeah, we didn't get that far into the statute when it was written in before. And that has been part of the issue. If you look back on some years, go back to 2012, 13, 14, we tend to stay stagnant. And that tends to be what lands us in court then. So with the Consumer Price Index built in, that should avoid that issue to a large extent. And you can see the dollar amount. What that 3% amounts to in dollars, approximately $189 million. And that includes a little additional amount. There's a footnote down there because of the delayed state aid payment. And that may be more than you want to know, but we're going to make up part of that delayed state aid payment that districts get in July.
One of
So
the things that I want you to look at, because as you talk to legislators, we're choosing 0809, and I'll tell you the reason, or Craig can tell you the reason. But other people will choose other dates and time by which to calculate the increase. And then you get all kinds of things like capers payments and things. But in 0809, the base was to be 4433 going into that year, which is $3 off of where we actually were in 1920. Craig, you want to talk about what happened that year and then?
Sure. So in 0809, we started the year, as Randy said, at 4433 for the base. And that was coming off of the Montoy lawsuit through the Supreme Court. And that amount made us adequate and equitable in their sight with one more year yet to come to finish off that phase in of funding. 0809, you may recall, was the year that we had the national recession hit. And so everybody ran short of money, including the state of Kansas. And it became apparent that the state did not have enough money to fund 4433 as a base, which is where we started. So we went to 4400 before the year got out. So districts built their budget on 4433, and at some point during the year had to reduce it to 4400. And for what it's worth, those numbers you see in each of the next 2 years, we didn't start 2009-10 at 4012. We started, I say we, school districts, I was the superintendent at the time, started thinking they were going to have something closer to 4400, and it got reduced, I believe, 3 different times over the course of that year. Same thing happened in 10-11. Didn't get reduced as often, but it was reduced in mid-year. And then that reduction and not coming back from the reduction, attorneys and districts involved will tell you is what led to the Gannon court case. And now we are in the phase-in of meeting the requirements from the Supreme Court of the Gannon case, much as we were in a phase-in back in 0809 for the Montoy case. So we started at 0809 because that's the last time at least when the year started, that we were on pace to be meeting the Supreme Court requirements for adequacy and equitable. Any other questions on that? Okay. So recommendations moving forward, the approved base aid, state foundation aid for each of the next 3 years, this year and the next 3, you see the dollar amounts there. In prior years, the board has frequently focused on fund the law. You know, at least for a start, let's fund the law. And at the moment, in the general fund and the base amounts, that's what the legislature's doing. So if they follow the process that they've laid out, they will be funding the law. So as a budget option, if you do what you have done some years, fund the law has been taken care of, as long as nothing changes between now and 2023. The other big piece of the school district's budgets, their LOB, Supplemental General State Aid, or the local option budget. You can see some dollar amounts there that have been provided. And if you go back to 15-16, 14-15, prior to that, it was not being funded at 100%. And that was tied to the recession and then some changes in tax policy, and funding was a little short. Since that time, the legislature's funded the formula at 100% for the local option budget, Supplemental General State Aid, and you can see they intend to for each of the next 2 years as well, based on the budgets they've passed. So again, if your recommendation would be to fund the law, no additional money is needed. And that's just the state aid portion of the supplemental general funds. So some districts receive no state aid on the LOB, some receive quite a bit. The general fund dollars you saw represents the vast majority of the general fund. There's a very little amount of money that comes in from other sources locally for the general fund. But that's another story. Capital improvement state aid, most people know it as bond and interest. And it gets a little confusing because we'll also talk about capital outlay state aid. But capital improvement state aid, you see how much has been provided each year. And again, there's a formula that provides state aid to school districts. The poorer you are, the more state aid you receive. And in 2015, the legislature changed the formula. And as a result of that change, if you compare the old formula with the new formula, this year, those districts that receive state aid would receive about 32% more. Now, some of the districts will tell you the other way to say that is we're raising 32% more locally in local property taxes because the state aid's that much less. But that has had an impact on the amount of state aid. And you can see that the increase that was happening, 129 million to 145 to 163, has slowed considerably in the last 2 or 3 years. We went from 189 to 202, and then in 1920, 203 and 205. In large part, that's because bond issues that were passed prior to 2015, some of those are being paid off. So that high amount of state aid is dropping off the rolls, and the newer bond issues are quite a bit less in terms of state aid. The other factor that particularly impacted last year and this year, like everything else, was COVID. It was not a good time for school districts to try bond elections, so we did not have many elections in the last 2 years. Having said that, the law as written is being funded. So if your recommendation would be to fund the law, no additional money is needed. There were bills introduced in each of the last 2 years to change the state aid formula for bond and interest so that 32% reduction wouldn't be quite so large. In neither year did the bills pass.
This is the Fort Leavenworth
Yes.
deal where everybody's set off of the poorest district in the state, which is Fort Leavenworth, because it's all federal property. In terms of that, correct?
Yes, that's
Okay.
exactly right. So in prior to 2015, the state aid rate was based off of the median school district. So all of our state aid rates for the different funds are different, but they are all based on your assessed valuation per pupil. So how much property value do you have in the district? Divide that by the number of students. That gives us an assessed valuation per pupil. And then we rank them low to high. And for capital outlay and for bond and interest prior to 2015, you rank them low to high and you go to the median number on that list. And that district gets 25% state aid. And for every $1,000 you are above the median, you get 1% less state aid. And for every $1,000 below, you get 1% more. Fairly simple, straightforward process. In 2015, They changed it, so you still rank the districts, assessed valuation per pupil, low to high, but you start with the lowest district on the list rather than the median, and that district gets 75%. And then for every $1,000 you are above the lowest one, you get 1% less state aid. So the theory's fine and well as far as it goes. The issue is in Kansas, we have USD 207, which is Fort Leavenworth, a public school district entirely contained on the military reservation at Fort Leavenworth. So it's all federal property. They literally have a Burger King and a credit union. That's the only private property that pays property taxes. So their assessed valuation per pupil, when you round it to the nearest thousand, is $1,000. The next lowest one is $26,000. Fort Leavenworth, in addition, by statute, cannot have a bond election. Nobody really lives there. They all move in. They don't have enough property value to pay for a bond election, so they can't have one. So really, your state aid is starting at that second district, which is 25% higher, or 26%, depending on the year. And that's why there's such a drop-off from what the formula had been prior. So the bills that were introduced each of the last 2 years would take Fort Leavenworth out of the calculation, which would have the effect of increasing everybody's state aid if you qualified by about 25%, which wouldn't be quite the same as it was prior to 2015, but significantly closer than we are now. And that is a factor for some districts in their bond issues. Maybe more than you wanted to know, but for those that work with that, that's an interesting low point. Thank you, Ben. Any other questions on that? Okay. One point to add, I guess, with bond and interstate aid, that's a revenue transfer for the state, for the legislature. It happens automatically. The legislature does not vote each year that yes, we'll fund it or no, we won't. When this portion of the school finance law was put in place, it was set up that way intentionally. They didn't want us to get in a tough year like the recession in 2008, 2009, and the legislature say, we can't afford to make that payment. We can't give you your state aid. You won't get it. And then some school district potentially would not be able to make their bond payment, because if they miss a bond payment, that affects the bond rating in the entire state. So they didn't want to make that provision a possibility. So this money is automatically transferred and payment goes to districts every year. Capital outlay state aid, and this is for the districts use this money just for maintenance of facilities primarily. This is not for bond issues like the previous capital improvement was. So this is maintenance of your facilities, repairing your facilities, those types of issues, buying a school bus. And again, some districts qualify for state aid, some don't. You see some years there where it was not funded. And again, that started in the recession time frame. Capital outlay was not funded just because the state didn't have enough money. It gradually came back, and then in 16-17 was fully funded, and that was in large part a result of the Gannon case. The Supreme Court mentioned that, and they made funding full. School districts are limited to 8 mills in their capital outlay, so this increase is typically driven by assessed valuation. If the valuation in your district increases, then 8 mills is going to raise more money, and the state will provide more state aid. And again, the legislature has committed to fully fund the law. So if that's your intent that you would like to have them do, their current legislation does that. Juvenile detention facilities, we have several of them around the state, not as many as at one time, but still do. Funding is a little bit different. They receive 2 times the base amount. So if the base amount next year is 4706, they will be funded at 9412, if I did that right. As a math major, never try to do math in your head in front of a group. With one exception, they receive the lower amount of twice the base or their actual expenditures. So they report actual expenditures to us, and then we fund them based on that or twice the base for the number of students they have. And you can see the history there. The funding has been somewhat consistent, up and down a little bit. We don't have final numbers yet for the payment this year. We anticipate it might be a little bit low. COVID affected those facilities as well. You can see that reflected in some other years. There have been some events that have dropped their participation a little bit. But it is being funded according to law. Special education. This one's a little more involved. And special education is probably one of the more complicated pieces of school finance. So a lot of information on this one little chart. You see state aid in the second column for each year, the dollar amount. And as you get down to the years 18, 19, 19, 20, 2021, and so forth, you will see the dollar amount growing by $7.5 million per year. And that is what the legislature built into their finance plan when it was passed in response to the court. Special education was not a part of the Gannon lawsuit, but when they passed the rest of the finance plan in response to Gannon, they included increases for special education of $7.5 million. The complicating factor is that by law, the legislature should fund 92% of the excess cost for special education. So you calculate how much districts receive for special education, how much for a, quote, traditional student, how much more does it cost to provide the special education services, and the legislature funds 92% of that excess cost. That, you know, I'll come back to this slide in just a minute. Yeah, oh, they are over there, I'm sorry. The excess cost is that last full column. You can see the percentage that we've covered. And we went back to 8, 9, and 10, 11, because that's when the last times the state paid 92%. And you'll see in 10, 11, we used federal ARRA money to help us get to that level. Again, during the recession, states didn't have much money, so federal funds were made available for that purpose. And it's been declining since then. So the natural question is to look at the recent years and ask, we've been putting $7.5 million in, how come we're still losing percentage of excess cost? Special education in total in the state is about a $1 billion expenditure. So $7.5 million to you and I is a lot of money, but compared to $1 billion, it's not a very high percentage. And when general fund budgets, the base is increasing by 3%, typically teachers are going to get about a 3% raise, all else being equal. Again, if your enrollment stays flat, those kinds of issues. $7.5 million is less than 3%. So special ed co-ops and interlocals can't keep up with a 3% raise even. They're not getting enough new money, which means they have to ask for more money from school districts to provide the services that are already being provided. And by law, they must provide those services. As a school district, when you sit down and start looking at how you're going to cut budget when times get tough, you can't cut special ed very well, because by law, you must provide the service. And I don't have enough money is not an allowable excuse. Which means if the state doesn't fund their share, then school districts must take that money from the general fund or the LOB to cover the additional cost. And that leads to the percentage of excess cost declining. Now, in fairness, there's another piece to this. The federal government, when they passed IDEA originally, stated that they would fund up to 40% of the cost for special education. They have not done that, ever, and currently are at about 14%. So in fairness, I have to say, if the federal government was paying something closer to 40%, then the state's payment that's being provided here would be a much higher percentage than what you see right here. The two work together. And since somebody might ask, ESSER funding doesn't get calculated into excess costs because it's one-time money, and we're talking about the dollars that the board chose to provide out of the administrative cost to school districts. So $8 million in 2021, $12 million in 21-22, and $12 million again in 22-23. If those dollars are factored in, then you can see the percent of excess costs on the far right-hand side, 74, 70, and 66.7. So even with that amount of money added, it's not a huge change, but it is some. And since somebody would ask, we tacked it on there. So special ed funding is tied to teachers and paraprofessionals. It's not a per student funding like your general fund and LOB are. The number of your school districts are reimbursed for transportation and for catastrophic costs, and I wish that term wasn't in the law, but it is. Catastrophic costs means students that have extremely high needs, and you have to hire a lot of staff to work with them, or you have to send them to a special program like Heartspring in Wichita, for instance, that's very expensive. A percentage of that additional cost is covered by the state. So after those two factors are taken out, the remainder of the money is divided by the number of teachers and paras, and then we pay districts based on an amount per teacher. And you see what's happened to that amount over the years. It goes up and down based on the allocation from the state, as well as the number of teachers and paras we add. Typically, we add in the neighborhood of 300 teachers and paras, and in that 300 calculation, a para counts as 0.4 for funding purposes. So when we say 300, it's a lot more head count than that, but that's the FTE. You'll see in 2021, the categorical aid, the amount per teacher, went to $31,465. And the year before it was $30,010. We started out this year estimating it would be $29,810. It increased because we hired 1,100 fewer paras statewide, primarily because of COVID. In a few cases, we didn't need as many paras, but in most cases, school districts couldn't find them. So there just were not as many out there. The school districts did add about 70 teachers, which is a little bit lower than normal. And again, it was a problem of finding people that were qualified for the jobs, and 1,100 fewer paras. So if you have fewer teachers and paras to divide into your allocation, you get a higher amount per teacher. So that's why that number increased quite so much in 2021. Predicting next year, and what we're trying to predict is how many teachers and paras will there be. Talking to a few districts, they hope to be able to come back to the number of paras they had before this year, but they're not sure they can do that. So our prediction is the categorical aid will go to $30,085 and then to $29,560. And again, it's declining because $7.5 million does not keep up with 3% increased cost, much less the increase that's created by additional needs from students that requires more personnel, more teachers, more paras. So options, unlike the prior funds we've been looking at, we aren't funding 92%. So if you say fund the law, there's several different ways to go about it. And we'll look here. One option would be to say, continue doing what you're doing, legislature. Fund, as you have approved, $7.5 million per year. That takes no additional money, and you see what the dollar amounts would be. It will go to $512 million, and then in 2023, the year we're looking at, $520.3 million. So that's one option. Just fund the 5-year plan as written. A second option that has been discussed in prior years by the board is target a specific percentage. Looking at the dollar amounts on the additional cost, you can see in FY23, to get to 68.7%, still well short, we need $27 million. And go to the bottom of that table, if you wanted the legislature to fund 92%, they'd have to put in $212 million. So recognizing that that's a lot of money, one option would be to say, pick a targeted percentage. And a year ago, the board chose that option and picked a targeted percentage that would keep the percentage flat in their recommendation, and asked for a dollar amount that would keep the percentage where it had been from the prior year. And you can see dollar amounts at a given percentage, and obviously we could plug in any percent you would so choose if this is an option that you're interested in asking about. A third option that has been used at times over the years by this board is phasing in. to get to 92%. Rather than trying to do it at one fell swoop or just picking a lower number to stay at, let's put a plan in place to get to 92%. This would be an example of a 5-year plan, and it takes $75.6 million each of those 5 years to get to 92%. So if you followed an option like this, you would be asking the legislature to add an additional $75.6 million each year. And after 5 years, we would be at 92%. Any questions on special ed? I kind of belabored that one, but there's a lot to it.
This is the most complicated part of school finance. And depending on the seat of what you're setting, so put yourself in the superintendent, it's most of the people that would be talking to you. As Craig said, not having special ed funding does not affect the funding of special ed kids. It affects your ability to fund non-special ed kids. Because you've got to do a demand transfer because they have a federal law that says you have to take care of those. And that's what you're going to hear. Well, okay, but my co-op or my interlocal said I had to have my assessment went up, and therefore I couldn't do as much money. I believe, this is Randy's opinion, this is a broken system. Craig's heard me say that. I think for a variety of ways. The federal government's never funded it at the level. The state almost can't fund it at the level, as you can see, because of the amount of dollars. And we're funding by the teacher and not the pupil, and it's hard. I don't have an answer how you get out of it.
Yeah.
That's really complicated. But this is a complicated issue that you will hear in the districts. They will complain about even in the good times, because Craig did a really, really good job. So you're not going to understand all this, but continue to learn about it, because your full understanding of this will, I think, impacts your understanding of how everything else flows around it. So thank you, Craig. You did a great job.
We could, if we chose option 3, we can choose any number of years. We
Yes.
can do it in 4 years, we could do it in 10 years.
Correct.
So that's, right now, 5 is just a discussion area, but we
Just-
could
yeah.
adjust that either way.
Just a number out of the air.
Okay. Questions? Michelle?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So does a student in that situation count as one pupil or a student and a half, or how do they gauge that as far as
The student counts as one student in the enrollment. So they receive all the general fund and LOB weighting as all students do.
okay,
And that's why the funding for special ed is based on excess costs. So above that you normally spend on a student, how much more did you spend for special ed services?
okay. All right, thank you.
Sure,
And of course, that varies
right.
tremendously from very little, if you have a speech language person or a slight learning disabled student, to you're going to get the catastrophic aid if you've got to send a kid to Lake Mary or Hart Spring because they're severe and they're a residential student. Again, this is all the complicated parts of it. And Craig would tell you, it takes you almost years to fully understand this. But the more you understand it, the more when you go to a board meeting or you talk to a superintendent, you'll understand why this is really, really hard to deal with. And I appreciate the Kansas legislature is in a tough place trying to deal with it also.
And it could be a few $100s to a few $100,000, the gap between
Right.
that. Ben, did you have a question?
Yeah, I just want to point out, because I hear about this a lot.
I'm sure.
And it is a hard concept to explain to a lot of people. But even though we've been increasing the Bay State aid, school districts, and I've heard it, has been running about a 5 to 10% increase every year in their SPED contributions to the co-op. It's been in that ballpark. Sometimes it's been 13, sometimes it's been closer to 5, just in the last couple of years. So a lot of that Bay State increase that we're giving, a lot of the general fund is going towards special ed. It's not going to the other stuff, and so we're spending more and more percentage of our general fund to cover this as well. Would that be accurate, Craig?
Yes.
And so
that's-
that money isn't necessarily going into the classroom as propagated. It is, but it's going towards sped services. It's becoming an increasing portion of the general fund budget, which it was never intended to do.
But as Craig mentioned, simple reason, there's lots of other reasons. If you're getting 3% additional money, and teachers, this is the time of year, right? We need to bargain. We know you got 3% more money if your enrollment's the same. We'd like to have 3% raise. School districts start to give that. That means special ed teachers get a 3% raise. They didn't get 3% special ed dollars. And just that itself puts you upside down.
Right.
Regardless of any other cost. So just continue to, from time to time, when you get questions, call Craig, get a little bit more information, and over time, you'll start to understand it more. But this is really hard. It's extremely complex.
And pretty much all this, pretty much all the sped money is salaries. With that, well,
For much more so than
The
general
general
fund and
fund,
LOB,
yeah.
because special education co-ops don't have football teams, they don't have, they do have buses, they do have those kinds of things. A lot of them do not have facilities, they operate out of the school district.
How difficult would it be if, whenever you come back next month, if you do that at 6 years, 7 years, 8 years, 9 years, up to 10 years?
John can do that for any number of years you want.
Well,
I was about to say, John, how much time do you?
I mean, I don't want to dump something that's complicated. I
Yeah,
assume it.
no.
But if that's not complicated, I think that we would be interested, at least I would be interested in knowing that would be at different years.
Sure. That
And
makes sense.
also, what projected budget surpluses we have statewide?
For a school district?
No, general.
Oh, I'm sorry, state, I'm with you, state revenue.
Census revenue, that sort
Yep.
of stuff. So if we could have that information too, at that, we don't need it now, but at that
Okay.
time.
Other questions? Okay. We'll try not to be quite as confusing on some of the rest of these. So parents as teachers. And you see the funding sources, the Children's Initiative Fund. We also had TANF in there for 1 year. And the dollar amount has increased a little bit, been up and down somewhat. In 18-19, a change was made for the districts. Districts have always been required to match the dollar amount that they receive for parents as teachers. And the match was reduced from 65% of the district's money to 50%. In 18-19. So that helped districts out a little bit with being able to provide their programs. It is being funded according to law. And you see the dollar amounts that are being provided there. Questions on that? And that program is for preschool age children and their parents. It really does focus on the parents and the family and providing education for parents more so than necessarily the student or the child in this case. Okay. The Mentor Teacher Program, you can see this is one that for a number of years was not funded. And I think I am accurate in saying it has not been fully funded ever. What it provides for is a payment to a teacher to serve as a mentor for new teachers for the first 3 years of the new teacher's career. And at various times, the state has funded the first year of the mentor, they've funded the first and the second year. They've funded first year and partially the second year, which is where we're at now, but never all 3 years fully funded. And you can see there the years it was not funded at all, and it has come back a little bit, and $1.3 million partially funds it, pays for $1,000 for a first year mentor, and I want to say 600 something in the second year, this year, is what was funded, and nothing then for the third year mentor. The $1,300,000 has been in place for, this was the third year and has been approved for each of the next 2 years. And the program, as you can imagine, is based on research about the success of new teachers and how that success level improves and the longevity of that teacher improves if they have a mentor. And the mentors must be trained. There are requirements. You can't just pick anybody to be the mentor. Must be a trained mentor, fully licensed, and teaching in that district.
Do we track or require them to send us the name of the teacher and the mentor when we
Yeah.
send them the money?
Yes, they have to tell us who the mentor is so that we can verify they're licensed and those types of things.
Okay, well, I know one district that had one mentor for all of the second-year teachers.
We know that too.
But if we know that, then we only send them money for one mentor?
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
And we're meeting the expenditure, I mean, we're utilizing all of this funding or?
Yes.
Okay.
We,
It's not something I hear about frequently, so I'm just verifying. We
yeah,
are utilizing all of
We
it.
back into the amount for second-year mentors. As I say, that's enough to fully fund first years, and then the money that's left, we divide by the number of second-year mentors so that we spend every dollar.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? And our estimate to fully fund the program, and it is that, an estimate, because we don't know how many teachers will be in their third year. Some unfortunately don't return after their second year, or they go to a different district, those types of things. But our estimate would be about $1 million to fully fund the program, additional to the 1.3. Professional development, again, in some of those lean years was not funded. Professional development provides that a school district can receive state aid to help cover their professional development costs. And the state aid is 0.5% of the general fund or a percentage of their actual costs, whichever's smaller. And so you see for the last few years, it was funded at $1,700,000, which does not cover the full cost. We fund about 20 to 25% of what we should. And as I said to start with, it's a small amount, and that doesn't cover that. And for the next 2 years, nothing has been appropriated to fund that program. So some options you could consider, move forward as it was passed in law and do not fund the program, return the funding to $1,700,000. You could opt to return the funding to a different number, more or less, as you chose. And again, the idea was by the legislature when this was originally passed, professional development's very important. Whether you're in the business world or the education world, doesn't matter. You're going to have to spend a fair amount of money and should be spending a fair amount of money on professional development. And the state wanted to help with that cost, to encourage it, but two, to indicate their understanding of the importance of that process. Transportation aid. The state has a transportation formula that is fairly good, and with one exception, and you'll see there was a legislative study that recommended reducing the threshold for state aid from 2.5 miles to 1.5 miles. What that means is that currently, in order to receive state aid for transporting a student, the student must live 2.5 miles from school or more. And we do measure that. In the old days, the auditors literally would drive from school to the student's house to verify that it was 2.5 miles. Now, fortunately, we have GPS, and so they don't have to get in the car and drive out there. But we do have to verify that. Legislative study recommended that's too far, and you can imagine kindergarten, first grader, not many of them are walking 2.5 miles to school, and in some places it's a danger aspect. If they've got to cross a highway, if there aren't sidewalks, any of those issues. So they recommended lowering it to 1.5 miles. The other issue that's a factor in transportation state aid, state law caps state aid at 110% of the prior year transportation expenditures. So districts report to us every year what they spent to transport students to and from school. And then their state aid is not allowed to be more than 110% of that number. So if you have a district that qualifies for a great deal of state aid, but they're really not spending much money, that was the legislature's way of controlling that. So that they're not getting excess transportation aid that they can then use on other programs. You see the dollar amounts, and these are truly an estimate of what it would take to decrease that threshold from 2.5 miles. We don't really know accurately how many students live between 2.5 and 2 miles and the impact that would have on the formula. But that's a ballpark estimate of what it might take to lower that threshold to each of those levels. Any questions about that? Okay. Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have a question. My home district, Turner, gets minimal money on transportation due to the fact that we're not that large, you know?
Right.
And it's a nightmare for the kids to walk. And frankly, when I was on the board, it apparently was agreed to when they unified that they would continue they would transport every child, and they do. I mean, if they're a block away, they transport them. And needless to say, they're not funded for that. My question, though, is, do we have any idea how many districts have this same challenge that are, you know, that small that they really don't get hardly anything? I mean, 2.5 miles is pretty big.
Yes, we can tell you how much transportation aid every district receives and compare that to, for instance, a total enrollment amount. But the transportation aid formula is based on density primarily. So how many students do you have more than 2.5 miles from school, given your square miles in the district? So if you are relatively small, even if your density is high, you're not going to receive a lot of money. If you're relatively small and your density is very low, you don't have many students out there, you really don't receive much money. But the theory is you're not transporting many kids either. A district like Turner that has chosen to transport every child, I'm sure their transportation state aid does not cover costs.
Well, I'm kind of confident it doesn't. Didn't when I was there. Maybe it's changed. Well, and another complaint I get from other districts is the fact that their child, maybe they live 2 miles from school or 1.5 miles, and the buses go right past them and won't
Yes.
stop and pick them up. You know, that's kind of sad.
It is. Every district has to deal with that issue. I think I can safely say that, and decide to either transport every student because it's not safe or for a variety of other reasons. They decide to transport every student like Turner has. There are other districts that, for financial reasons or others, hold that 2.5 mile line pretty firm, and they won't transport a student that's less than 2.5 miles.
Yeah,
Some districts will transport you less than 2.5 miles, but will charge a fee. If you're willing to pay a fee, then you can ride that.
Oh, yeah, I know that, I know that also. That's another complaint we get. You know,
Yes.
Turner does not charge fees because needless to say, we have a pretty high, low socioeconomic population. But this is something we've fought since I've been on this board. I mean, we were fighting it when I was on the local boards, you know?
Yes.
And we've never done anything about it. So one of these days, I think we need to address it.
And the heartburn comes from just what you suggested, those parents who live 2 miles, 1.5 miles from school, and the bus drives right by their house, but they
Right.
can't get on. The other issues, of course, are parents that have to be at work by 7, and the school's not open till 8:30 to drop my child off. What do I do for that hour and a half?
I know my daughter paid, she lives in Olathe, so she paid for her children too, because she had to be at school early. She's a teacher. She had to be there before they got there, you know, so needless to say, she paid for her children, so. But a lot of people cannot afford it. They just simply don't have the money. So, thank you.
Whatever your policy is in a school district, you want to keep it. If you change it, there will be a line outside at the next board meeting.
Well, and from a safety point of view, there's a lot of places that it's dangerous. That 2 miles or that 1.5 miles is
Yes.
a dangerous walk.
Yeah, if your sidewalks are limited, or if your students have to cross a highway, a railroad track, anything along those lines.
That's true in
You
Turner.
have other factors than the
We-
distance to worry
We don't have
about.
sidewalks in Turner, so
Yeah.
our children are walking on the streets, so it's kind of sad.
Other questions or comments? Okay. School lunch. And this is a little different animal this year, the year we just finished as well as the coming year. Typically, the majority of the money in the school lunch program comes from the federal government or from the sale of meals. Kids buy a lunch ticket. The federal government funds free meals and the majority of reduced meals. The state has a little bit of money in it, and there you see the amount per meal, 4.5 cents. $2.5 million is not a lot in the state budget. That's the level of state funding. Last year and again this coming year, so in 2021 and 21-22, because of the pandemic, USDA has allowed every student to eat free. So the federal government provides a higher level of reimbursement because they do it under one of the summer food service programs, which pays a higher level of reimbursement. And so all the revenue, basically, other than this $2.5 million, is coming from the federal government. So that's a great thing for our students, for our families. Last year, the decision was made in late September. This year, it's already been made for the coming year. So it's created an issue for school districts. You will recall at-risk funding is based on the number of students that qualify for free meals under the National School Lunch Program. This is being funded under the Summer School Lunch Program, which is technically somewhat different than the National School Lunch Program. So yes, everybody eats free, but not everybody qualifies for free meals under that definition, so not every student qualifies for at-risk funding in the general fund budget. So school districts now have to find a way, because every student will eat free, USDA, we don't believe, is going to provide a free lunch application. That would be pointless. Everybody qualifies anyway. So school districts need to find another way to identify which students would have qualified for free meals, so we know that they qualify for at-risk funding. KSDE has and has used for a number of years a household economic survey, HES, which somewhat mirrors the free lunch application. We ask how many members are in your household, what's your total income level in the household, and then we can compare that to the USDA guidelines to see who would have qualified for free meals. We started using that a number of years ago when community eligibility came into place, and that's an issue that allowed individual districts, if enough of your students qualified through direct certification, in other words, they participated in other social benefit programs, they qualified for free meals automatically without filling out a survey. Well, if you had enough students, 60% was the trigger, who were directly certified, all your students could eat free if you so choose in that particular school. So those schools were running into the same problem of how do we identify kids who would have qualified otherwise? And that's when we developed the Household Economic Survey, and so we've used it for a number of years in those districts. It's also been used a great deal in the tax credit for low-income student scholarship program, because incoming kindergartners can qualify for that program. Well, incoming kindergartners haven't been in school, they haven't filled out a free lunch application. So they've used our household economic survey to determine if they qualify for that program. That's the instrument that school districts will use this year to determine if students qualify for free meals under the traditional guidelines, which will then qualify them for at-risk funding. So the issue school districts are grappling with, if I as a parent already know my child's going to eat free, I'm not going to bother to fill out your paperwork in some cases. Others will. So districts are including the Household Economic Survey in their enrollment application. Some of them are building it into their electronic online application to encourage parents to fill that out. They are informing those that charge fees, typically do not charge fees to students that qualify for free meals. The Household Economic Survey will be the way they'll identify those parents that will not have to pay fees. So they're using that as an encouragement for parents to fill the form out. There are a number of different avenues they're trying to follow, but I know it's an issue that school districts are concerned about. That has nothing to do with what you may or may not ask the state to do here, but it is an issue you're going to hear about if you haven't already.
Has there ever been any consideration given to streamlining? Because this is a complaint I hear a great deal from parents who are enrolling their kids. The amount of paperwork
Yes.
is overwhelming. Some things, if they can skip, they will, just because it is just too much. Oftentimes I wondered, if you're asking the same information, but with a different heading, why can't we do something about that? Do we ever take a look at the amount of paperwork and the possibility that that might be more of the problem, that people are not providing the information?
The short answer is yes, we do look at that. And the Household Economic Survey is one example. We don't ask for everything on that form that USDA asked for on the free lunch application. Because we're not using it for the same purpose. We don't need all that other information. We take it off. But you're right about the amount of information parents have to fill out the first of the year. They've got to enroll the student. If it's a district that charges fees, what activities are they going to be involved in? What classes are they going to be involved in that might generate a fee? There are a number of permissions that by various laws, both state and federal, you have to get from parents before the year goes up. Field trip permission, participating in particular surveys, all those types of issues. And the easiest way for districts to get the information back is to send it all out with the enrollment form. And so you're right, it is a flood of paperwork. And just personal story, when I was a high school principal, I was so proud of all the information we gave to parents when they enrolled and how well we were communicating with them. And in those days, it was all on paper and a big envelope would come, and I thought we were doing a great job. And then my kids got in school and I got one of those envelopes. It's not nearly as much fun on the parent side as it was on the principal side. Which doesn't really answer your question, but I like telling the story.
And this is more out of curiosity, and this is probably speculation, this is probably going to be last year the feds are going to do the summer lunch program, or is that, we have no idea
We have no idea.
whether they're going to make it permanent or not?
Right.
And if they don't, what would be the cost to the state to do universal school lunches?
We receive in the vicinity of in a normal year, $140 million from the federal government for school lunches, lunch, breakfast, snacks.
But to
So
provide,
and that covers primarily, not entirely, but to a large extent, free meals and reduced meals, and then a smaller amount even for the paid meals they pay.
I guess my question is, and if we can, what would, and maybe not this year, but next year, because this year, or no, we are talking about next year.
Yeah.
What would the cost be if we were to provide universal meals to kids in Kansas?
Well, to finish the math, so if we receive $140 million, and this top of my head, but we could get you more accurate numbers, we're somewhere in the neighborhood of 40% free lunch in the state, so another 60%. And again, don't do math in front of a group. Whatever, that'd be another $160, $170 million easy.
Okay, I was just curious. It's come up. Schools have loved it because they haven't
Sure.
had to chase parents down for lunch money.
Yes,
In terms of lunches, it's been a headache completely removed from the school day, and it's come up in several conversations I've had.
it's paperwork wise, back to your point, Betty, it's much better system when you don't have to do all that for the school as well as the parents. And as a district, you know there's not a family out there that's not receiving free meals that should be, which is quite a benefit. Okay. So again, state money in this particular program is not a great deal relative to federal and local. National board certification is funding for those teachers who go through a process nationally to become board certified. And it is a fairly strenuous process. It's a lot of work for the teacher, a lot of professional development, and a lot of personal development, I think would be the best way to say it. And national board certification provides a $1,000 stipend for each teacher that completes that process for as long as they are, as they maintain that license, that national board certification license. You can see the funding over the years as well as what was approved for this year, and it has not been funded for each of the next 2 years. One note, in statute, districts are required to pay teachers that $1,000, whether the state funds it or not. So, pre-K pilot, you see there, and again, we have a mixture of funds. the Children's Initiative Fund and the federal TANF money have been used to fund that program and are now both being used to increase the funding. You can see how that's happened over the years. Serves approximately 4,150 students, 3 and 4-year-old in the pre-K pilot. This is separate from the 4-year-old at-risk program that is funded through the general fund. So this is a different early childhood program. Some of this money comes from the tobacco settlement. Remember that when that was big news quite a few years ago, we're still receiving money from that, as are other states. And a large portion of that money, or I shouldn't say large, a portion of that money is directed toward early childhood. The Children's Cabinet is currently working with others in the state, other agencies in the state, to adjust that funding because they're not getting the same percentage they were at one time. Did I say that correctly? Percentage is a little bit lower. So they're working to adjust that funding so that they will have a little bit more from the tobacco settlement, which would allow them then to expand programs like pre-K pilot as well as other early childhood efforts. Any questions about that? I'm sorry. Yes.
At one time, anyway, not every eligible child was able to be served under this program.
Mm-hmm.
Have we reduced the amount of students who are at risk that, in other words, have we increased the seats that are available? Right. Or are there still children that should be served that aren't?
There have always been children that could be served who were not. There were not always, not every district participates in the pre-K pilot. So if they weren't participating, they may have been serving those children with their own funds. They may not have had a program for early childhood, and so those students weren't being funded. This particular program, for a few years, the funding was about right. In fact, maybe just a little extra for the costs of those who wanted to participate in pre-K pilot. The last year or two, it's been real close to, do we have enough money to cover everybody for the program they want to have? And so Amanda Peterson, who's our director of early childhood, has put together some information for school districts in the coming year to look at help them look at their budgets and the money that is coming in for early childhood programs, primarily through the 4-year-old at risk and the other weighting factors that they get with those students, to help make sure we're funding what we can so that the pre-K pilot dollars can be used more appropriately for those districts that truly don't have enough money to provide for their early childhood program. But I would never say we are meeting the needs of all of our early childhood students by any means.
Okay, thank you.
And Dina, I can add to that because during the pilot process, superintendents really the form changed this year.
Yes.
In terms of that, but roughly, I mean, you see the $8 million. They had $20 million in requests, and only $8 million to do. So school districts know about this because it's flexible and you can serve 3-year-olds, whereas with a 4-year-old at risk, you can't fund 3-year-olds. And so there is a big need, and one thing I've been working on, I've talked with Amanda and Melissa about funding and supporting the initiatives of CIF and advocating for a 1 or 2.5% increase, which is supposed to be in statute, and supporting their position in doing so, which allows more money. It's not going to solve the need, but it'll start to address those needs for having access, especially in our rural communities that need access to early childhood as well as our larger, but especially in the rural when a private one just cannot be economically viable because the amount of kids served. So it is an issue, and I, going forward and supporting those initiatives that they're wanting.
And the other factor on this, and this maybe getting off topic a little bit, but related topic, but doesn't necessarily have to do with funding. When I say we'll never meet the needs of 3 and 4-year-olds, I think Amanda and Melissa Rooker have done a great job of working with communities on their early childhood. So it's not just the school district trying to provide early childhood education. Shouldn't be, that's Craig's opinion, and probably never will be. There are other good programs out there that we need to be working with instead of trying to bring everybody into the school necessarily. So it's a bigger issue than just state funding in school districts. Career and Tech Ed Transportation, this is actually not a statutory program. Statute does not require this funding, but when the what's known forevermore as Senate Bill 155 was passed back in 2012 that provided funding for students to go to technical education or community colleges and receive technical education programs. They also included funding to cover part of the transportation cost. So if you as a school district were transporting students to those programs, you received a percentage of that money back to cover your cost based on the number of miles you drove. And you can see that the dollar amount basically reached a certain level, $650,000, and stayed there. In 1920, it was quite a bit higher. We had some money that, not an accurate term, but was carried over from the prior year, and the division of the budget allowed us to apply that to this program so that we could cover 100% of the cost rather than 38%, as had been the case the prior year. And that program was not funded this year and is not scheduled to be funded for each of the next 2 years. So some options you could consider are allow it to be unfunded as they passed, return to what it was at $650,000, or obviously a different number to provide partial funding. And again, all this does is cover transportation costs to get the students to those programs. And typically when we talk about this, we can't let the opportunity pass without saying it's been one of the more successful programs that the state put in. The initiative to encourage students and provide students with technical education has been quite successful. Numbers of students have increased dramatically.
Mr. Porter oftentimes talks about collaboration. You have an outcome of post-secondary success. There are a number of kids that would go to vocational technical schools, but they can't get there. I think of Ashland all the time, one of our most remote districts. It's a long way to Dodge City. I mean, and that's where they would have to go. This, and then when we talk about work-based learning and liability to go into businesses, are ways to partner so that your outcomes and what they want to do, it's just a matter of getting them there. This is a rural issue with kids that just have to travel long distance. It's not so much, you know, if you're in Hutchinson, Hutchinson's right there, so you don't have to travel. You can walk, yeah. So this would really enhance your goal of trying to help every kid get post-secondary credential. And again, an area that the legislature could help in, because you'll hear the rural districts really struggle funding-wise with this.
Okay. Other programs, there have been discretionary grants for after-school programs, two separate programs, an after-school program and a middle school after-school program. It's been at $312,500 for a number of years. We just put a few of them on the chart and was funded at that level this year. It tends to be, I think I can safely say, the same programs that receive the same funding each year. Those programs were not funded in 21-22 nor in 22-23. So your options would be to allow that to continue or ask for the same amount or a different amount. And since the amount's been the same every year, that's why we keep funding the same programs. There's been no opportunity to expand. They have been successful, but that money statewide, you can imagine, does not go very far.
For the next 3 years, however, I believe that this is an acceptable use of ESSER funds.
This would be an excellent use of ESSER funds for local districts, and you have approved funding of some after-school programs with administrative ESSER funds as well.
Craig, was this in the governor's budget recommendation, or, and the legislature just ignored it, or she didn't ask for it, do you know? Because that was kind of her thing, I think, when she was in the
The
Senate.
governor took it out.
She took it out?
Yeah,
Okay,
So it was not a part of her original recommendation.
all righty. Thank you.
Thanks. Information technology education opportunities. We refer to it as the Journey Ed contract. This is the program that provides Microsoft certification in a number of areas for students, also teachers for that matter. And there's only one organization we can work with to provide the contract. Microsoft sets it up that way, so that's why we call it the Journey Ed contract. That's who the contract's with. Historically, we provided $500,000 to cover those certification exams for students so that they could take the classes, do the training, and then the exam was paid for. Governor and legislature both eliminated funding beginning next year in FY22. So again, options continue with the funding eliminated, ask for it to be reinstated, prior level, or a different amount as you would so choose. Juvenile Transitional Crisis Pilot. This is a program unique to Beloit, the Beloit School District. It's run through their special education co-op, which they are the district that runs that co-op. You can see in 18, 19, and 19, 20, it was funded at $300,000 a year. It was not funded this year. Funding has been returned for each of the next 2 years. Pilot program designed to help students struggling with social and emotional needs. Beloit will tell you it has been pretty successful for the students that have gone through their program, but it is limited to just that one site. Safe and Secure Schools. This was the program started in 2019 that provided for our Safe and Secure Schools team that we now have in place, John Calvert and Jim Green, as well as $5 million for grants to school districts each of the first 2 years, and then it was not funded this year and is not scheduled to be funded in future years. This is one of them that the legislature asked you to fund with ESSER monies, which we don't think it would have applied the way the legislature had it lined out. And there you see the dollar amounts and what's happened. If you would choose to ask for that to be funded in FY23, we would probably ask that you attach language to that. Don't require that the money be used for securing entrances and video cameras. There are a number of other security issues that need to be addressed. In the first 2 years, it went for those purposes and was limited to those purposes. And we had districts, particularly in the second year, asking, our entrances are in good shape. We need to do some different things with that money. Communication with local law enforcement, communication with parents, a number of issues like that that they couldn't use the money for, that are a part of the Safe and Secure Schools process. So if you choose to ask for additional funding for this program, we would suggest maybe look at one of the other options, and we can tell you what those are if you want to explore that. Mental health, this is another program that the legislature asked you to fund with ESSER funds. And again, the dollar amount that was funded this year is being continued for each of the next 2 years. There is no additional money put in that would allow us to grow, and you can see in that middle column, the number of districts has grown pretty steadily the first 3 years, 9 to 32 to 56, and that's probably where we're going to have to stay since the dollar amounts have not changed. We have surveyed or are in the process of surveying each of those 56 districts to find out what changes they might want to implement next year. Will they need more money? Will they need less? And again, as you mentioned on one of the other items, this is an area districts could use ESSER funds to help with. So locally, they have some options to, if they've got a program, to expand it. If not, to add services using that money. And a year ago, the state board asked for $3.9 million. That's where that number came from that was in the legislative request. You asked for enough to expand the program again a year ago, and it was instead recommended for ESSER funds. ACT and work keys. So this year, the legislature passed legislation that would allow students in accredited private schools to participate in the ACT and work keys exams like the students in the public schools have been doing for the past few years. At the same time, the contract with ACT expired, so it has been renegotiated, and in FY23, the contractual amount will be what you see at the bottom of the screen there, $3,332,500. That's based on assuming every student that's eligible, as far as we know, participates. That typically does not happen. The current appropriation is $2,800,000, and in all reality, that will probably cover the cost based on past participation rates. But ACT builds the contract so that it covers the entire cost. That's what we'll put in the budget request, and if the number of students is fewer, then the money is not spent, it goes back to the state. So the issue for you to consider is whether to ask for that additional $532,500 so that if the contract needs to be fulfilled at the maximum level, we have that money built into the budget already. Statewide dyslexia coordinator. May ring a bell for you. The legislative task force recommended the creation of the dyslexia coordinator position 3 years in a row. The board earlier approved using ESSER funds to fund this position for FY22, basically so that you can get the process rolling and get that individual in place to serve the needs of our districts and our students. So the question becomes, future years, how will that position be funded? One option that would be available would be to ask the state to fund that position. The legislature, approximate cost of $100,000 to fund the dyslexia coordinator. And that's it, just in time. I'm sorry, yeah, that's, I will tell you, I used to tell my school boards, school finance is like a Russian novel. It's long, it's boring, nobody really understands it, and in the end, everybody dies. I never had
War and no peace, right?
I never had any complaints about that statement until one night there was an English teacher in the audience, and she was offended that I would compare school finance to something like a Russian novel.
Well,
And
I
any,
said, I don't like this part of what we do, but this is extremely important, and
It is.
appreciate the effort that you've gone through. We will be going through this process again next month, but at that point, we'll have to make decisions.
Yes.
And if there are things that board members think that we should consider in addition to what is there, please, we're not going to have that discussion now, but between now and next month, please contact Craig so that we can have at least discussions if there are other areas where we think they need to be. But thank you very much. I don't see any other questions. Any other questions? I think you covered it pretty thoroughly, and we're not dead yet.
Okay, glad to hear that. Thank you.
Let's take a little while. Let's reconvene at 10 to 11.
can't do this. Oops.
Stay in the corner.
I will stand in the corner. I know my place in life. I want a hat, please.
The vice chair is is expected not to be whiny. If you will look at, agenda item number 6, it is a list of tentative dates. Actually, for the next 2 years. And we will vote next month on these dates. Tentatively, we will look at April and May. These are standard dates, but in both April and May, with the approval of the board, we will go to one of the schools that we represent in April and spend the day there, and then the other one in May. So instead of trying to rush through the state school for the blind and deaf, we'll give more time to both of them. I have discussed that with both superintendents. They seem to be very pleased with that prospect. I've always felt that we were really rushed at those times, and there was a whole lot more that if we are in fact going to take our role as their boards seriously, we need to spend more time with that. The tentative dates in 2023, sometimes we adjust the January dates. I don't see we have to this time because of the swearing in ceremonies and because the new board members will be sworn in at that January 10th time at that point. And sometimes we have to make adjustments in November because of because of Veterans Day, but that doesn't appear to be the case. Are there any questions, comments, or suggested changes? This is not an action item this month, but it will be next month. We'll vote on these in July. Ernie? Ann?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We were talking to KBOR about aligning our vacations and the college vacations. So do these propose, on spring break? I don't know if that has any impact or not, but I just wondered where that was, if we know.
I don't, do you know? I heard some discussion shortly after our meeting, but I haven't heard anything since then. Do you know?
No, unfortunately, Craig would be the one that would have that information. I don't know.
Well, we've got a month to find out, but I just thought if we're meeting on spring break week when everybody's supposed to be off, we might want to adjust that, but we can find out.
And I don't believe we are, but we can find out.
Okay,
I
thank
would
you.
say that early in the month, it's unlikely, but it's possible.
Yeah, I don't know if they were going like the second week or the third week. They had, I can't remember now. Anyway, we can find out before next month.
Peggy, can you see if you can find out if there is a common spring break, when it may be? Okay, any more questions? Well, then that will be an action item next month. There have been some changes in navigating change since our April the 14th meeting, and it says here that Randy will review and update guidance from KDHE.
No. I can do it from here. Simple recommendation from the medical team. There's no longer, we would remove from navigating change on the operation side any recommendation for mist foggers. Those are no longer because of air, the propellants that are used to mist it. So they're recommending you just wipe things down. You don't mist classrooms. That's it. That's the recommendation. So would remove any guidance to do that in a school.
Okay, those are changes to navigating change, and there is a recommended motion. Dina?
I move that the State Board of Education accept the changes to the navigating change document.
Okay, is there a second to that motion? Thank you, Melanie. Everybody else wake up. Ann?
I kind of like that thingy that was proposed where the kids walk through this tunnel and they get showered with spray and then they do the UV light, and remember that one? Did that fall off the list as well?
And some other, and then I think it goes back to the Russian comment about the Russian novel. You go in the dark then, right, for the rest of your life or something.
Okay, earlier I mentioned that everybody needed to wake up, and you go back to sleep now. All in favor of the motion, please raise your hand. All opposed, motion carries. Thank you. We have the list of board travel. Peggy asked us to make sure that we gave that information early. I try to always do what Peggy wants because I'm afraid of her. However, since that time, I've been asked to participate in the new Superintendent's USA thing, which is the 15th of June. And that's going to be an in-person thing here in Topeka. So I request that be added. Any other additions to travel? Janet?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I believe I asked for it last month, Peggy. I just want to check the juvenile justice meeting on the 18th. Was that already done? Thank you.
Okay, so everybody else followed the instructions but me. So a motion would be in order to approve travel. Michelle makes the motion. Ben seconds the motion. All in favor, raise your hand. That was a unanimous vote. And at this point, we're going to have committee reports, and we will start with the policy committee.
The policy committee did not meet this month, but we are working on going through the entire policy and guidelines, and we'll be meeting next month.
Okay, thank you. The communications committee, Melanie and Jim. Well, we're going to get through earlier. Any other committee reports? Ann?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The Student Voice Committee did meet, and it has my name on it, but Melanie and Betty and I all contributed to that. We met last week and set some goals for our committee for this year, but one of them I wanted to bring to the commissioners' attention is that when we go out and do these road shows again, that we want to make sure the student voice is included in those focus groups, and particularly students who are marginalized and not often listened to. So that was our big request, and then we're going to each try to get out in schools and speak to students directly in our own districts, and also look for this summer and fall, hopefully some of the student statewide organizations will start to meet again, and we can go to those. If any of you are already planning to go to some student statewide conventions, we'd like to know so that we get them all covered. That's our report.
Anything else? Mark has told me he's tried to find one of those Russian novel type court cases to talk to us about, but has been unsuccessful. So is there anything else you want to add with? We appreciate your brevity. I've always been told, when you talk about committees, I've always been told that the optimal size for any committee is 3, provided 2 people are absent. Request for future agenda items. There are 2 things I want to bring up. First, we've had some questions about perhaps we should be at least giving some guidance in the area of screen time, the amount of time a student spent on screen time. Melanie brought that up. Would you like to expand on that, Melanie? And then we can see how we need to proceed from there.
Thank you. Certainly, I sent a rather lengthy email on the topic that I believe has been shared with the department. But the idea was that I have heard from several parents and teachers who are asking about guidelines by age or by grade, as well as just how much time students should be spending on screens. And this was a difficult thing to discuss over the past year because of the pandemic. Everyone was on screens. So now that we are kind of returning to a new normal, I think this would be a good time to talk about guidance to share with the state.
Yeah, and I wonder if there are, surely somebody has put together some guidelines.
That's exactly what I was thinking, yeah.
And at least that would be, that's,
I think, Melanie, you would know this, because I know you looked at this. The American Pediatric Association, I believe, a few years ago didn't they give some sort of guidelines or loose guidelines on that?
I don't know the numbers off the top of my head, but I'm sure that there
Okay.
are some in writing.
Yeah.
I think it would be good to tie those to a classroom environment, especially when we have schools that have one-to-one initiatives, so they're sending devices home. We might need to reinforce with parents as well, you know, what would be appropriate for their students.
And the definition of screen time is interesting, too.
Absolutely.
Whether it's social media screen time or, right? So you've got just the visual part of screen time, and then you have the non-productive part of
Right.
screen time, kind of like TV, so.
And so I don't want to go too far down the rabbit hole, but part of what that guidance might include then is what should be provided on iPads and laptops that are distributed to students. As far as apps, yes, thank you.
so we need to see if we can find, first of all, if somebody's already invented that wheel, perhaps we can see what's been done and then use that as part of a discussion, and we may need to have a workshop at some time in the relatively near future to discuss that and perhaps come up with some, remembering that we are a local control state, that we can still provide guidelines and information. And a major benefit of that would be an information also to parents. Another issue I want to bring up is that we need to start, later on we'll talk about this more, but we need to start thinking about our legislative priorities for next year. And so I'm going to ask Dina and Ben to go ahead and start the process of putting together their recommendations, and I would like for that to be an agenda item in September. So the rest of the summer. And in doing that, I would like for us to also consider a more aggressive support to the schools for which we are directly responsible, and part of their process, School for the Deaf and the School for the Blind, as part of our legislative agenda. I'd like to, now, this is just my thoughts, and so, you know, you can always take it off, but I would like for us to at least have that as part of our discussion, so we can take, because I've always been concerned that we're responsible, but not very active in that responsibility, except show up once a year, and I would like to be as supportive as we would if we were actually a Board of Education to them. So, I would like.
With that, some of that, and this might be a question for Andy or Craig when he comes back. Poor Craig. A lot of that would be funding requests, like the language assessment program would be a big one for School for the Deaf. Because it's reached the point to where it's expensive and we can't do it in-house without extra funds. Does some of that need to be with our budget request going in, or is it automatically attached with ours? Or do we need to, because that can't wait till September.
Their budget request, because they're a state-funded school, goes directly to the legislature.
Okay.
It doesn't. So it's a different process, but it'd be the same timing.
Okay.
Same timing.
Okay, thank you.
So would that be then, need to be something on our list or something on their list? Or both?
It would be something, I think, starting on their list that then would come to you for your support or not support of.
Okay.
Right now, they submit it directly to the legislature, the Office of the Budget, and then they go over and testify to the legislature on the behalf of each school, is the process.
Yeah.
Who actually does that for them? Who actually?
John and Luann.
John and Luann, yeah.
Okay, okay, Janet, I have you twice.
Well, I've been done for a long time.
Okay, Michelle,
Thank you, Chairman Porter. Yeah, I was curious about the School for the Blind does their 5K run in September. It's actually the weekend, we're supposed to be out west, but as a board, but can the School for the Deaf do something like that? Are they allowed to do something where they can
It'd
get
be
the
their-
community involved and,
Yes.
and is that something that I should
Yes.
suggest to them, or?
Yes, because they have more of a community than John does.
Yeah.
I mean, they have a very vibrant, and the broader Olathe community embraces that school. So, yes, they could do something very similar. I mean, they could do a fundraiser. It doesn't have to be
Yeah,
that'd be
I mean, it's a nonprofit
Yeah.
organization. I mean, it's in conjunction, it's the KC Blind All Stars is the name of it. And it just raises money for the school for initiatives that they do on campus. Like last year, they had the new playground that we got to see. That was something that they did. And now it's the gym. So if you haven't signed up for the 5K, now's a good time. I have to do a video promo for it later, but yeah.
But
Right, Melanie?
you do have to set up a foundation.
Right.
Yeah, it's easy to do.
And then my other question was the email that you received about setting up from Kristen from our area about like a kind of diverse group of parents when how do we talk about that as far as like what you had proposed to her or how she should set that up?
So, okay, so what Michelle's talking about, we received an email from a parent in her community that happens to be a former student of mine and her husband and in Concordia and knew her family well. Asking, hey, how can I get more involved maybe in giving parents giving advice and support to schools and school districts. So one of the things that I think all of you know is I have advisory committees, and I've been thinking of some time of having a parent one. Now, that doesn't mean that I don't have parents that represent other things. And so what I'm thinking is having each of you give me 2 names of parents in your area, which will give me a 20-member advisory, and we would meet virtually a couple times a year. I usually say, hey, there's some things we're thinking about. You can't go tweet these things out because we're in the formation of them. Give feedback, right? So that would be at the state level, Michelle. What I don't think that Kristen knew is that the site council is in every building, and most districts are begging to have parents serve on those, which should give advice to the budget and do we wear a mask or playground safety and all kinds of things. And that's required by law. And then the third, at the district level, while not required by law, most school districts have parent advisory councils, both on a permanent basis and then on an ad hoc, meaning we're going to study X, and then they put those together. So that was what I was trying to explain to her. And Michelle, did you have other questions or thoughts on it?
That was really good that she came up with that.
Yeah.
We had an issue where we just thought more parents should have been informed of something, and so she sat down with the principal a couple weeks ago, and her and her husband, and they just talked about, hey, before you just do this, you might want to, because people weren't informed about it, it's like, you better communicate, first of all, or maybe some parents, and a diverse group of parents need to look it over and say, you just can't throw that out there without at least some parents overseeing that.
This is true of any organization. You never can communicate enough.
Right.
Never. And so if you think back to when we closed schools in March, COVID, and you think about like the change we just made on misting, there was never something that we went forward with during that time that we didn't call or Zoom KNEA, KSB, USA, and then we went to the navigating next subcommittee chairs, Justin Henry. There were some teachers vetted that, and then we had a superintendent advisory. Then it came to you, but that was part of before. What does this look like? And that's what you want to do, right? What does this look like? What would you want to change? Here's why we're doing it. And the more you can do that before you vote on a policy, the more informed you can get. Where generally schools and other organizations get in trouble is there hasn't been enough discussion to develop the good policy until after the policy, and then you're in a fight. And then you don't know how to undo it, right? And so slowing that down, right, Jim? I mean, it's just tough. And so I would encourage when patrons call you, ask, have you volunteered to be on a site council? Because I will tell you, principals are begging for parents to be on site councils. And they have a lot of it, they get a lot of great input if you're on a site council. No, the principal says, thanks, Michelle, you're on. I mean, literally will be that easy.
Yes, I have encouraged my daughter to do that, but so
I don't
she
think
hasn't.
parents know about that.
I want to go back to screen time. If at all possible, I'd like to have some information by next month about, if there are things. And I'm going to ask Mark and Scott back there if they can wake up. And do you know anything about that? Have you seen any surveys on screen time? Okay. I thought, except for the fact that both of you are wedded to yours.
Can we kick Scott out for that joke?
This is a public meeting, so I guess we could go into executive session real quick. And
He's
minutes.
press, he's not public.
For 2 minutes and watch him. Okay. Well, we are way ahead of schedule, which I don't think anybody really objects to. We're going to change the room arrangement a little bit by putting some tables out here so that some of us can sit at the table and some of us sit there. We can look at each other as we start this process. So even though it hadn't been long since we've had a break, we're going to take another short break to set up the room. And then when it's time for the meals, we'll take another short break to get that started. But then we're going to, in about 10 minutes, we're going to start that noon conversation and then probably get through earlier than we had anticipated. So we're taking a break for however long it takes to set up the room. And Peggy, I'm sure, would welcome help. You know, we don't have to go back very far. The examples for this year were a couple of of efforts to change graduation requirements. The civics test and financial literacy were two examples. And the fact that we've been told that one of the efforts next year was going to be computer science or computer, that, you know, as a graduation requirement. Well, if we are going to look comprehensively at graduation requirements and then we keep getting these onslaughts of things that are not part of our agenda, that's going to complicate that. And not only is it going to complicate that, it's going to make it impossible for us to do our mission. And so my goal, I have several goals, but one of my goals is to make sure to see where we all are, because I don't want to speak for the State Board of Education without knowing what the State Board of Education believes. But I believe that we have, if you recall a couple of months ago, can I talk about, no, I can't, because we did that in executive session, but I'll use an example. If there were a target, and our responsibilities, you know, we have some responsibilities that were in the midst of that target and some of them were on the outside. I would like for us to, at this point, identify that target. What should be in that target that we believe are our responsibilities and our responsibilities alone. And then I would like, my goal would be that we agree on that and then communicate that to the other various publics, which would be the legislature, the governor, the other state officers, the organizations, to say this is our belief, that these are our responsibilities, and that is both unambiguous and non-negotiable. There's another side to that. There's almost an opposite side to that. And that is, I would also like for us to also always communicate that we want to be partners. We don't want to be in an adversarial relationship with the legislature. We want to be partners with the legislature. But we need to be on an equal basis. You know, we don't need to be the stepchild that they think that they can say, you need to do this, without ever discussing with this, without ever knowing that whether or not it is from a research basis sound. Because those of you that attended the Civics Advocate Network, I listened to that, and since it was Zoom, I don't know who else didn't pay attention to who else was on there. But we were told by a couple of the presenters in that a civics test, a rote civics test, was actually counterproductive to civics education. But yet, a law was passed that had we accepted it, and had it not been vetoed successfully, we would be in a position today, instead of having this discussion, whether or not to defy the legislature. I would rather not be in that position. I would rather make a statement identifying our position so that at least if they're going to do things like that, they would know what our reaction was going to be. Now, I'm not afraid, and you understand backgrounds. By being a school superintendent for over 30 years, I've always said that if I had not been threatened with a lawsuit by Wednesday, I was not doing my job that week. So I've been threatened hundreds, if not 1,000 times, with a lawsuit, never one being filed. I don't make decisions based on what might happen, but I would hope that we would be in a position where we take a very strong position and be willing to go that route if it happened. because I believe that we're in a strong position to say, based on the information we even got yesterday about during the commissioner's report, about the responsibilities of Article 6, Section 2, that our responsibilities are. Now, I identify those, and I'll shut up in a minute and let other people discuss this, but I identify absolute responsibilities are graduation requirements, licensure of teachers, accreditation of schools. I would consider those dead center bullseye issues. What else should be in that list?
Standards.
Curriculum standards, yes. Now, I've dominated the conversation so far, which is very poor leadership style. I want to now actually have a discussion about, I've identified what I want to do. I want to make it clear what our responsibilities are, and I want to communicate those to the various stakeholders with an equally strong message that we want to be partners and communicate and work together instead of working against each other. And so I'm going to open it up for your reactions to those statements. Or if we need to be going in a different direction, or if I need to shut up and let's go home.
Chairman Porter, what are, I think we need to define who the stakeholders are when it comes to education. I feel it's the children and the parents, not the businesses, not like the outside, yes, they can have but as far as like in school and education, with the Department of Education, what do we mean by the Department of Education? Are we talking, and then stakeholders, if we don't have children, you don't have your schools, you don't have your education, you don't have your jobs. Those stakeholders are the children and their parents.
Oh, I absolutely agree with that. What I was thinking about is those people that are making decisions for education. And right now, the people that are making decisions for education are us. And as Randy has talked about, we need to involve large groups of stakeholders, including students. And Ann talked about student voice already today. Randy talked about parents. We've talked about side councils. We've talked about all those things. They're not making statewide decisions. We are. The legislature is making statewide decisions at the request of the other statewide elected officials. And so, I totally agree with what you said, that our mission is to the children of this state. And our major partnerships need to be with their parents. But other organizations are making decisions, and that's what I'm concerned about, is people making decisions that are forcing on us that we then are expected to force on those parents and children's and school districts. So it's I'm not disagreeing. I absolutely agree with what you said.
There's a lot of stakeholders, there's a lot of agencies and committees.
But they're not making they're not officially making the decisions. But the legislature is in an official capacity. The governor's in an official capacity. The attorney general's in an official capacity, and we're in an official capacity.
Yes.
And I want us to define our responsibilities and make a pretty strong public statement that this is our responsibility, and we're not going to let you mess with it. You understand? I mean, does that make sense?
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay, I'm going to be quiet in a minute.
So I'll chime in. Local school boards. We've got to protect the autonomy of local school boards and their ability to make decisions.
Was your blue light on? Okay, I don't know whether that was heard or not, but the statement was that we need to absolutely protect the autonomy of local school boards. Okay, What else?
I always, you know my favorite saying, whatever, I said it 300 times in the last week. Everyone loves local control until you don't.
Microphone.
Until you don't like whatever decision is made locally, and then we want someone else to say, well, no, we don't like that local control decision, so let's do this. So the Constitution is a beautiful document, right, Mark? It's a beautiful document, and it lays out very clearly in Article 6 what the role of the legislature and the state board and local boards are. And it's very simple, and it clearly says, and then there's some case law that says, here's kind of the state board's role, and then the operations of schools and how all that goes about is important. But right now, and next week it'll be something else, right now, all of you are getting on probably a daily, weekly basis, what are you going to do about critical race theory? That is a curriculum that may or may not be taught, but it's not in our standards at all. But they want you to do something about it, right? And then, that's just the topic of the week. I mean, next week it'll be something else because whoever's emailing you doesn't like that topic. That's what makes this difficult. Because then if you don't react, where do they go? The legislature. And of course, the legislators are wanting to do what their constituents want. And then we start to rub that against the Constitution, in my opinion.
Well, and that's why probably in our list of what's in our target, the center of our target ought to be exactly what the Constitution says, the general supervision of schools, because there are going to be all these other things that come up, you know, odds and ends of things that are actually in our bailiwick as well, and we should have first say-so over.
And I think one of the things, I mean, what I've done in the 6 years I've been here is when the legislature that has done something, I've whined and complained, and maybe spoken to individual legislatures, but that's why I really think that we should make a statement and communicate that with them so that they know exactly where we stand, and they'll know if they want to deviate from that, they'll know that there's going to be consequences. But we still have to make sure that we keep the lines of communication open. We can solve problems. I think I've already said this today. The issues that they wanted to do with ESSER, we could have helped them if we were part of the process. In some of those cases, you know, if it's against the policy, it's against the policy. You can't do it. There was more to that because they also recommended that they that school districts give stipends to teachers. And that's clearly against the regulations. There are ways around that, but they didn't have those conversations with us. They just did it. And they need to, and that's the way it's always been. So I can't even be as angry as I would like to be with them because that's the way it's always been, and there's never been a reaction except maybe today when Craig sent that letter saying we can't do this for this reason. You know, it's easy when you're not in these chairs. But I know and I hate to say this in front of Janet, but I've always been a little critical of the State Board of Education until I got here because I thought they were too passive. You know, let things happen. And that may be just a false assumption because I was out in the Ozarks or down in the southeast corner trying to mind my own business and whining. But I really think that it's time for us to make a definitive statement.
Well,
Yeah, go ahead, Jim. Jim and then Janet.
friction between branches of government is not new. There's always going to be some friction, overlap, and it's there. The House and Senate don't particularly like each other, you know, and that doesn't go just for Kansas. As we watch, you know, the dynamics play out, and that's by design. That's not a mistake. The branches of government have different roles and responsibilities, and historically, they are always at wit's end about, why are they doing that? That's my job. I do that, you know. So I don't take it, Jim, as personally maybe as you do. You know, I see it as part of the design of what we do. On the other hand, I do believe that for many legislators, there's a sense that they know better. Many of the things we've seen on graduation are being popped up throughout the nation. Some have passed them, you know, whether it's computers or whatever we've been talking about, you know, and the interesting thing is that we're one of only 6 or 8 states in the country that have a state board that is empowered such as us. And for many legislators, even our friends across the street, they think they're in charge. And they think of us as the other places, you know, the other states. We have a constitutional authority, which changes the dynamic of our relationship, as opposed to Illinois or Indiana, New York. We're elected officials. Most states don't elect them. We're partisan. Most states, many states are partisan, but some are not. You know, yeah. So on one hand, I see it as part of the dynamic of the design of our governmental system, that there's going to be friction between us. On the other hand, the willingness to work together and to understand each other better is the issue. So instead of sending them an ultimatum or this or be damned, it might behoove us to take a little different approach, a softer approach, in terms of helping them understand, which we've been trying to do over the years, and is frustrating, but we're always going to do it. There's a whole, the change that just occurred this last election, changed the whole dynamic of the House and the Senate, you know, and I just don't want to go over there with a fist in one hand and a fist in the other. I'd like to be the adult in the room and understand the process, and work in ways like this to reduce the tension and to increase the cooperation. You know, just trying to tone down your statement. I agree with everything you say, but just toning it down to where we don't start from an adversarial position, but we start from a position of, you know, we're working for kids, you're working for kids, and even though they don't play well, we have to play well. We're bound by that, you know. So enough of the lesson. I think this is great, but I don't want to, I'd rather go with an olive branch than a hammer.
So
And
Jim,
that's
are
why
you
we're
saying
having the discussion.
we should have a
Next.
statement, but not promote it? I'm just looking for clarity about what.
Oh, I mean, make a statement and then say, golly gee, we're done? Oh, no.
I mean, have a policy, but not necessarily deliver it over there.
Oh, no, yeah, no, well,
Okay.
we send a message, yes, you
Okay.
know, and quite frankly, I'm in the same place as Jim. If they cross the line, I'm not gonna be, the olive branch turns into a hammer. I mean, yeah, gonna play nice, but there's rules, you know, and the Constitution sets the rules, and you're out of bounds, and then that's why you bring in the officials, you know, the Supreme Court or others, and the judges, and they say you're out of bounds. You know, no, I just don't want this meeting to turn into a session where we're gonna just go after them, you know, because we're angry about what's already happened. You know, take a more structured approach but understanding that eventually, if it happens, we have to stand up for our constitutional right, without a doubt.
And that's why I've said, you know, I think we need to make it clear what our responsibilities are, but we also, on the second hand, we need to make it clear that we want to be willing and equal partners in the process. Janet,
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
you can call me Jim,
Thank you, Jim.
or the other Jim.
I guess the thing I'd like to start off with is just, I'd like to say, we've come a long way, baby, since I got on this board. Because when I got on this board, the only thing we did legislatively was recommend a budget in education. That's it. We had the legislative liaisons, and they went over, but they couldn't really speak for the board because the board hadn't taken any positions. So I'm just, and I guess even myself, I thought, I didn't understand. I thought, well, I don't know why we don't do this, but yet I thought, okay, until it finally hit me when we started getting into this financial thing, and their lawsuits started pounding up and things. And I was reading I was going places and talking about what the Constitution says. They're in charge of finance, we're in charge of all this other stuff, And it hit me then, I thought, well, we need to really get stronger on this. And that's when, I'd say within the last, 10 years, probably the board has recognized their responsibilities. And so I applaud everyone here that recognizes these responsibilities. And I absolutely agree. This needs to be stated. We need to make it perfectly clear in a nice way. And I think we need to quote the Constitution. And I was sitting here too, and someone told me, and I guess I'm gonna have to throw this to you, Mark. When I first got on the board, someone told me that the court had ruled prior to my service that our regulations had the same impact as law. And therefore, we were almost a fourth branch of government. Now, you need to make sure I'm stating that. Do you know what I'm talking about, or?
Executing powers and your authority to issue.
Microphone, Mark.
I think what you're referring to is the self-executing powers of the board, that you can issue decisions and mandates and rules that don't need legislation to enact those rules. And so that we've talked about that over the years, that, given your constitutional authority and the concept of self-executing powers, that you could take action on certain things that, you don't necessarily need to wait on legislation, to do. And so.
Okay, well, thank you. That's what I understood when I got on the board, because had never really heard the ruling, but that's what I was told. So, I think it's crucial. We need to clarify. We need to do it in a nice way, but we need to make sure everyone understands while protecting those locals. I would agree with that 100%, because I served as a local board member, and I feel very, very strongly on local control. And let's just make sure everyone understands what their positions are in a nice way. But anyway, no, I'm very supportive.
Ben and then Betty.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Or Jim, or Porter, or the other Jim, whatever you want to go by now. And to follow up on that, because I had a question, when is the last time, and you may not know the answer, Mark might know the other Mark, might know the answer, Scott, when is the last time Board Authority has been in courts? Would it be the early 70s? Like 74, 73, somewhere in that neighborhood?
I mean, it's been commented on in different cases, federal cases and state cases on school finance and other. I was thinking about the Cope litigation where, the state board was sued in the 10th Circuit. It went to the 10th Circuit in terms of focusing on the division between, the role of the legislature and the role of the state board. But in terms of the specific, whether or not this issue about what's kind of in the bullseye of the authority of the board, I would say it's back in the 70s.
70s. And how many policymakers do we have in government that was anywhere remotely paying attention to that when this happened? Dale Dennis, yeah.
Upstairs.
Yeah, upstairs. And so, in terms of educating, yeah, we have the Constitution that was done in the late 60s. Article 6 was added, but then the court cases in the 70s, and we very rarely talk about that because the Constitution is overly broad. General supervision. What does that mean? It could mean a lot of things, but then it got narrowed and defined in the courts in the early 70s. And so when we talk, yeah, it was before Porter's time even. Well, maybe. You were in Missouri. You were in a different state of being.
Janet's older than I am.
Oh, I didn't want to know that, but thanks. But when we educate and when we send that message, it's not just the 67, I think it was 1967, but it's those foundational cases that were in the early 70s as well that really laid the groundwork for a lot of this and why we're taking the stands that we are. Because when I tell them, well, this was also, our authority was challenged in the early 70s. And you talk to legislators about it, like, what? They just see the Article 6 and that's it. They don't know that there's been court, and I don't know that, I think a majority of us maybe knew or maybe not, talk about it. We don't talk about it very often as those court cases that narrowly defined it. So when talk about messaging, I think that's an important aspect of that is we have gone to court over it. And this is what the Supreme Court said.
Betty?
Well, actually, Ben had highlighted an area that I was going to focus on, which was when it stated general supervision. What does that mean? From my perspective, I'm not seeing it as adversarial. I am seeing it as a need for clarity. What does that mean? What specifically falls under the headline of general supervision, general guidance? What duties does that spell out? Because many times I kind of have the impression that it's because people really don't know what it is you're going to do. And that's why the boundaries aren't really clear, because your role really isn't clear. And I would look to seek for ways to offer clarity on this falls specifically here, this falls specifically there. And when you have those lines, now if you take this kind of action, clearly you've crossed the line, but those lines need to be put in place. That's my thought.
Mark?
The reason I've settled on the bullseye analogy is because you have different rings, not just one bullseye, but you have rings that become closer to the core or the center, the heart of the issue. And so, the reason that makes sense to me is because when you have, however many rings you have, the Supreme Court has said that general supervision involves, licensure of teacher, accreditation of schools, graduation requirements, and curriculum standards. But the reason there's no clarity is because the court on other issues or other specific topics is because that hasn't necessarily been challenged and the Supreme Court hasn't ruled on that. I mean, we know that outside the bullseye is the financing of education. So if you were to do your Venn diagram, you'd take that and you'd put that outside the rings. And there might be other cases or other topics or issues that would be outside of that. But anything that's either not in the bullseye or outside the ring is it's just going to be a gradient. It's going to be a range. And so within those middle rings, however many you want to put in there, I've been beating the drum a lot of times that there's certain issues that do feel offensive to the authority of the board. However, in those rings, if it's not in the bullseye and it's not outside, you do have a coexisting authority, and you do. It doesn't mean that the legislature can't pass laws that have to do with education. So the conversation that we don't have at the table as much, but I would advise you, and I'm not giving a specific, but I would say choose your battles, because we want to make sure that the issue that we challenge is as close to or ultimately be found to be in the bullseye if we do challenge, because you want to reinforce your authority. You want to be sure that constitutional mandate and the self-executing authority is preserved. But the last thing you want to do is choose something that's not closest to the center and lose on that issue, because if asked for my legal opinion on a specific law or issue, I will say, maybe it's in the gray area. Maybe it's something that both the legislature and the state board can have influence on, because it has not yet been determined by the Supreme Court of the state of Kansas to be within the specific constitutional authority. There are a number of topics I think that you have addressed over time that, in my opinion, are within that bullseye. But you've addressed them in a thoughtful time, in a way that's solicited input from your various constituents, throughout the state, brought it forward, studied it, and made, either changes or shared your information with the legislature as to where you think that would end up. One thing kind of on a separate topic, but I think about the hurried approach that the legislature just by their very nature imposes on the board and the agency during the legislative session, because it seems like they cut down the number of speakers. They will have a hearing, with very little notice, and it's henny penny, the sky's falling again because they're going to take something up this week. Well, the inherent problem for the board is you can't act as one. You're only meeting, monthly. It's only something that you're going to do. You're only going to call a special meeting in the most urgent of situations. You've got people spread across the state, so you can't react as quickly as they can, and the agency will send somebody over, and your liaisons will go over and provide input, but you can't possibly react with the kind of insane time deadlines that are created when something just comes to the floor for debate. So I think that, one thing I would encourage the board to do is maybe, continue to work on white papers or position statements, or build a library of what you typically call future agenda items, where I'm sure that there's a repository, and I'm sure that, Commissioner and others say, hey, we presented on this, we've had PowerPoints, but maybe create ways that when those issues come up, we can recall that, or we can share that this is something that's been discussed and been presented on, and rather than, saying, how dare you, do something that's in our, in our bailiwick, try to say, well, we've studied this, and it might be, it's something that we've looked at in a thoughtful way, solicited the input, and, might be in a better position to defer to us either on a future item, or here's information that we have already gathered to help you make the best decision possible. And then they'll look to you as the authority and resource, not as the turf battle that, hey, you don't have any authority, because we know that won't sell either. So those are just my thoughts.
Thank you. Betty brought to mind when she said that we have the general supervision. And I was thinking, yes, with the graduation rates, all the things we've mentioned, but I have a couple of others that I think that are our responsibility, and maybe you guys won't agree, but I feel, particularly with COVID, the safety and security of our students is a top priority. Another one would be the social emotional piece that we have promoted. So at least those areas, I think, should be our responsibility, but we could discuss it.
Jim and then Dina.
I do want to bring up an elephant in the room. The legislature controls the money. And, hey, if we're going to give you the money, you're going to do what we want. Just a thought. But that money thing does put us in conflict with them. Today we were making recommendations to the legislature about money. Spent a lot of time on it. They can throw it all out and do what they want, because that's their responsibility. So, and just a thought as you move forward, as parents say, I'm paying the bills.
As we move forward, Jim.
As we move forward.
Dina?
Thank you. Well, several people have indicated that maybe it's a definition. Seems to me that, and Mark alluded to some of the things that could be included in such if we came up with a list. But I have heard a state senator in explanation of the reason why the legislature has the authority is because they're to provide for an education. So it seems to me that we have overlapping definitions of what our roles are, and at least in some cases. So I think we do need to know exactly what the court has said is the bailiwick of the state board, and obviously funding is obviously the one that the legislature has. So provision to me is creating the opportunity for schools to exist and making sure they have the funds to operate. But perhaps Mark would disagree with me. So at any rate, seems to me that maybe we need to start at some very basic areas first and try to come up with some mutual definitions, because if we don't, we're going to continue to have overlapping, and that may be intended as well, because there's another little statement, and any other laws that we are asked to implement, and so it's, since we don't have those individuals who crafted the constitutional amendment sitting here amongst us, we probably don't know for sure. But we might call back in our emeritus person. He might be able to tell us a little more about it. But at any rate, it just seems to me we need some very specific knowledge ourselves of what the Constitution, not just what it says, but what the court has said, and then we can kind of extend from what the court has already said and include other things. But at any rate, I just think we need to kind of stay very basic in a lot of our explanations.
Did you guys say that, Randy?
So,
Well, I think Mark and Scott, Gordon, Dale, and Craig could do a nice workshop with you about the Constitution and case law, and probably that needs to be done. I think what you may want to focus on is, what does it look like to collaborate with the legislature at a different level? Like, you will go over and have a joint meeting with the Board of Regents. Do you need to invite the chairs of K-12 budget, Senate Ed, and vice chairs, and have a conversation before the legislative session about what do we want to work together on, and what do we see the issues are going to be? I'm just throwing that out versus, sending something over. So maybe it's a combination. You have a work session for you to understand, but we approach this differently about what do you want, invite them to have a work session, or like we do at the Board of Regents, what are the things we have to go accomplish together? What are your frustrations? What are our frustrations? And that would have to be a series of meetings and develop a relationship, because those chairs will change and the state board members will change over time. But if you establish some kind of protocol that lives on beyond you, is really, I think, what you might want to do. Just a thought.
I think that's a good idea.
I would like to agree. I think that really is the way to go. I agree with that approach. I think it would benefit education in Kansas if we were able to work more effectively with the legislature, just like we're trying to work more effectively with KBOR. I think we come at this from two different standpoints. We always consider the effects statewide on our decisions because we deal with small districts and larger districts, and there are different things impacts on them. The legislature they have a much broader task before them, and some of their things are local, some are statewide, and so I think they come at things from a little bit different standpoint. That they also use a lot of negotiation in trying to get things done and building alliances with other people in the legislature to try to complete their tasks. I don't know that we necessarily do so much of that. So I think it's really important that we educate and communicate with them, that we have ongoing discussions, and really talk about our areas of interest and what their areas of interest. If I look at some of these things where no action was taken or where action was taken over our objections, some of those might have been able to have been accomplished on the no action had we maybe educated or worked with people beforehand, because I would think that there would be some to carry our standard on those topics. And on the areas where they decided to do something over our objection, there's really nothing on there that's not probably a good idea, but there was probably a lack of understanding of what was already being done. And so ongoing discussion would really help that situation. I would really like to see, I think what you're talking about, Dr. Watson, is ongoing meetings, probably beginning in the fall before the legislative session and when they are starting to think about issues between our organizations and possibly including KBOR, to try to establish a working relationship that can be separately implemented by all three or bodies to really benefit the state. And I think we could start that this year. And I think we will probably have to all offer the opportunity for this and to try to create those relationships, because they do it in the legislature through friendship and relationships, and I think we can do that as well with them, and I think it'll be beneficial for everyone.
Is lunch ready yet?
We're waiting on the fruit, but you're bringing it first, everything else is ready.
Okay, let's,
The other thing I'd like to say is that in all of the meetings that I've been to, food is always appreciated and helps to get people talking and working together well, so we ought to feed everybody when that happens.
Hard to talk when you're chewing.
Doesn't matter.
We'll take a little time to get ready for lunch and then come back. Well, we're well ahead of where I expected to be at this point, so let's kind of maybe, I think we're at the stage now where we need more information before we can move forward. And so, Mark, could you investigate our report then next month on the legal, the case law, so we can see exactly what's been said as we go ahead? I want to pursue, first of all, I'm going to put together a statement that we can adjust, that we can discuss and adjust next month. What we do with it at this point remains in limbo, whatever that is. Limbo is a judge. Limbo. But we'll determine what we're going to do with that. And then I think we probably need to explore a suggestion that both Randy and Jean have made about maybe meeting with people and seeing how that goes. And I would suggest that we not wait till the fall, but do that as early as possible. My experience with a couple of the people that are in leadership is that I've requested meetings and they've not responded. So but that's an unknown. But at least we'll know that, and I'd like to start that process if it can happen early enough so that if it doesn't happen, we can shift gears and do something different before. But at least let's start with the effort to try to build those relationships. Does that sound reasonable? And then we're going to continue to have this as an agenda item on Monday afternoon until we come up with something. What did I say? I'm going to tell you the same thing I tell my wife and children. I want you to listen to what I mean, not necessarily what I say. And we'll do this. We don't necessarily, yes, ma'am.
The thing that could really kick it off would be to ask for a meeting with them just to talk about our legislative agenda. If we decide that, well, we'd need to decide it in September, but if we could decide it by September, it'd give you a launch point to, talk about some topics we think are important.
Okay, Dina, I'll put you in on the spot. Can you have a tentative agenda next month?
You can handle it. I have faith in you. Yes.
That's not the first one I do.
Dina, think you can do that? Okay. The suggestion has been made that can we, when we have if we have an initial meeting with legislative leadership, if we can discuss our legislative agenda, and if we don't start discussing that until September, that might be a little late. Can you and Ben have at least a tentative agenda by next month?
My month is pretty full. I don't know about the.
Minus 2. I think I think we're gonna have something. Well, that's what we can have something together by July, whatever, the 8th or whatever that is. Is it the 13th?
We could start.
Yeah, if you could just have something.
I mean,
Because we're going to add to it or subtract from it, and probably not subtract from it, but we're going to, have other suggestions. If things go a lot faster if we have something in front of us, even if it's incomplete. So can you at least have a tentative incomplete?
yeah, I mean, I'll find some time.
We can give it a shot and see
Yeah,
what we can come up with.
yeah.
We always like positive answers. Anytime I ask a question, I always like for the answer to be yes.
You almost got a really big no. Like, can we push it back to August and compromise a little bit?
I'd like to at least, I think time's critical.
I would agree. I after giving up 4 months of my life being over there and then having 1 month trying to catch up on all the stuff that I've got going on at home just to catch up on stuff. But we can get it done by July. It won't be pretty, but it'll happen.
Okay, okay. And so then the plan would be for Mark's going to report on actual case law, Constitution and case law. I'm going to have something that talks about the bullseye. And also I'm going to talk about, I'll have two missions. One is to identify the things that we think are non-negotiable. I'll not use those terms. I'll be more diplomatic. And secondly, our willingness, actually our, not only willingness, stronger than that, our desire to be a cooperative partner. And then the third thing will be, we'll start looking at the legislative agenda. Is that acceptable to everybody? In that case, we're adjourned.
The graduation people can't leave yet.
Unless you're on the graduation committee, and then you can't leave.
Just for a few minutes.
The other reason for the hesitation
No, maybe.
is that I want to meet with our education partners as well.
We can get this wrapped
And to
up
get
in
that done.